was probably the first one to recognize that something was wrong, even though I had like the medical training. I remember telling myself, yeah, you feel like crap. It's understandable. Look where you're at. Look what your daily life is like. Man, when I get back home, when I get to my mountains, it's all going to be great. I got home, I got to my mountains, and it was terrible. It was worse. And even though I had the training medically to realize something was up, I didn't want to admit it for lots of reasons. And Trey, and we touched on them. There's stigma around asking for help. I say when I'm out speaking at different places, in Appalachia, we all kind of we don't talk about mental health at all, period. Every family, we've got somebody in the South. If you're rich, and as my dad would have said, you're a half a bubble off plum, you're known as eccentric. But being from Appalachia, where there are very few well-off people, we're just crazy. And we don't talk about our crazy. We keep it in the family. We make excuses for those folks in our family that might be half bubble off plum. And if you grow up hearing all that, and then you come back and you're like, oh man,
I don't want to be that guy.
Yeah, some of what I'm dealing with, man, that looks like Uncle Bob. And man, Uncle Bob, we've always made excuses for him all my life. Well, I can't tell anybody that I'm dealing with that, because then they're going to be like,
or jokes about.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so because we've held it in for so long, it's hard to crack that egg back open. I credit, my wife is a saint, and she's also a licensed clinical social worker. And she knew coming in that, I had brought stuff home. And one of the most, I guess, telling things for me in my journey of realizing how much my experiences had impacted me, and also learning how to take those experiences and help other people, was she and I had been married for about 6 months. And periodically I still will have dreams, and I will be combative in my sleep. I mean, it's terrible, but my kids are like, if you wake dad up, tap his foot, don't get near him. We've had to teach them that for their own protection, and so that I don't feel terrible if I wake up swinging. But my wife looked at me one day and she said, I went to school, I was trained clinically in mental health, and I thought I was prepared. I thought I knew what PTSD was. But it's totally different when you have to live with it. And she looked at me and she goes, and that's just for me. I can't imagine what it's like for you. She's like, I get a break. And that hit me. I'm like, wow, because I didn't think about it. I didn't think it was that big a deal, because for me, that compartmentalizing, I can control every aspect of my life throughout the course of the day. But I think, and this is something that I've kind of heard from other veterans as well, for those of us that have been in those situations that still struggle with those things, I can keep myself busy all day long. I cannot think about it. But when you lay down to close your eyes,
you're not at peace.
You give up the control.
Yeah, you're not at peace.
It's interesting, kind of what I've heard. I wasn't married. I got married while in the Marine Corps, but after a lot of other stuff. So I didn't, it is what it is. But anyways, what I've heard a lot from people that they've had talk about the wives and them living with you having PTSD and all that, where I've heard the biggest problem with that disconnect between that service person and their wife is, for us, when you're downrange, every day is like Groundhog's Day. You literally are doing the same thing every single day for a year, however long. And you wake up and you're basically just doing the same thing over and over and over. You're having the same conversations. You're getting your workouts in. You're getting your PT and you're cleaning your guns. You're doing your patrols. You're getting you some chow. You're going to bed. You wake up. You're getting your PT and you're getting your lift in, whatever it is. And it's cyclical every single day. So in essence, for that year or whatever that you're gone, your life is frozen. Nothing, it's every day's the same. And then you come home and everyone else, your kids are a year older, your wife's a year older, everything in your life is a year older. And no offense, to a certain extent, your friends have forgotten about you. You know, they've moved on. Not saying that you're no longer part, but they've had to live their own life for a year. And you come home, and like I said, in your mind, time was frozen. And now you're having to jump back into reality, and it's like, damn, you got gray real quick, you know, or whatever. And you got married, or you got a kid, and in your mind, you just were gone for a couple of weeks, because it's just this repetitive impulses that can do the same thing every day. But when you get home and you see everyone's life has moved on, that is not the easiest thing to deal with either, because now you've got to not only deal with what you've seen, done, happen, been around, but then you've got to reconcile the fact that everyone else has moved on with their lives. And that's a whole different transition also.
Trey, you don't know this, but I'm in the back of my head, I'm thinking that everyone in my clinical community needs to listen to what you just said right there. If they want to become culturally competent in dealing with veteran communities, they need to hear that soliloquy right there. The last like 3.5 minutes or whatever it was that you talked about being completely isolated from the rest of their social interactions. That was gold. And I don't know if you're on video right now. For the listening audience, we're doing this on Zoom because that's the thing these days. Trey's not on video, but Jay and I were nodding and smiling, and we're like, yeah, I totally get that. No, I'm not a veteran. I didn't serve. I just know people who have, and I come from a family full of cops. But like, I've heard these stories before, and the way that you guys drive this home without intent, like you're not intending to convince the listener, right? You're just speaking it, but it's so impassioned. I love it. And I hope that people hear this and really come to understand that there's a very different culture that goes on in military service, whether or not you're turning wrenches at Fallon Air Base and you never get deployed, or you're in Mogadishu or Fallujah and you're actually exchanging fire. Like, it doesn't matter. What Trey said right there, I think is absolute gold. You're away, you're conscripted, you're in line, you're doing the thing, and then you have to return at some point. And that's the point, right? So we've got folks who return to common life, whatever that means, and they have to integrate, whatever that means. How do we do it? How do we meet our military veterans where they are and acknowledge without patronizing, without doing the whole like, thank you for your service thing, and they're like, I didn't want to like sign up for this or whatever, because I know there's conflict there. But how do we actually acknowledge culturally what goes on in a veteran's life broadly, without patronizing, without selling them short, and to circle back to the Second Amendment community, how do we acknowledge gun ownership as an integral part of that culture, and not just write it off as like, oh, guns are bad and you're baby killers or whatever?
I mean, for me, I think that the thing is, I think about Trey saying he was 19 when he left. Makes me feel old. I had finished college. I was 21, and I was the old guy in my cycle of basic.
I'm the young guy in this podcast is what I just realized. I'm going to be 42 this year. That means you guys are like way older than I am.
I am 45, yeah.
I'm 43.
Oh, well, yeah, see, I'm the baby.
But I think the thing that we fail to recognize is, like, we've got 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds that are going to the furthest reaches of the world and are being asked to make life and death decisions every day. Whether that's because they've risen through the ranks to be an NCO at 19 or 20, or, their job is to make sure that $5 million or $2 billion aircraft that's been shot up is patched up, repaired, fully operational, and ready to redeploy within 24 hours of coming back from a mission.
And by the way, drones.
Well, yeah. And then, but then those folks, when they transition out, like I do some of this work with college professors. I'm like, you may have a 24-year-old and you look at them as they're considered, non-traditional students, but you treat them like you do an 18-year-old. Man, that kid, when he was not 18, 19 years old, was responsible for a piece of equipment that by itself is worth more than half the companies in my entire area. And he was making huge decisions. Don't treat him like a child. Don't treat her like a child. Don't treat them like they are fragile or they are broken. Acknowledge the sacrifices they've made, but also acknowledge the experience, the education, all the other things that come along with that when you look at most, you got a guy or a gal that goes in at 18, if they do an average hitch of 4 to 6 years, 24 when you get out, 24, 25, but man, they've already lived a lifetime. And I think part of where we fall short is we discount all that. Like, oh, you were just in the Army. You were just in the Marine Corps. All you did, I have a buddy who literally said to me at one point in time, he goes, man, what are you having a hard time with? You were just a medic. But he had no concept of the fact that, like, as the medic, I was right there with every one of those 11 Bs. And not only was I there with them, I was like doing an additional job where I had to take my attention away from the immediate threat and focus on something else. And I think that's a problem that we have, like, culturally. We don't acknowledge the experience. And we just want to focus on the weaknesses instead of the strengths.
You're making me feel a little guilty right now, because I worked campus escort back in the day when I was back in college, late 90s, early 2000s. There was a guy named Danny Moore who was honorably discharged Ranger, and he worked campus escort with us, and he played rugby and whatnot. And we always like kind of teased him. It was like, Danny was a Ranger. He could kill you with his pinky. And we totally undersold the fact that what you just described is like, yeah, Danny was 24 and we were all like 20 to 22 or whatever, but he'd lived a lifetime overseas, and he probably couldn't kill us with his pinky, but Danny was badass, man. And he had this quiet, calm coolness about him because he'd seen the world. He didn't need to get wrapped up in all the sorority, fraternity, political campus BS that most of us were talking about, because he just already, resolved to find himself. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think that is one of the areas that we fall short in, and not just society. I mean, I think I was on a call with you, Trey, where we were talking about, or with the VA. So there are times that, we do not do a good job of educating those individuals that are there to take care of veterans on how to understand veterans.
Yeah, most definitely. I think a lot of it comes down to, and kind of what you were saying going back into it, is the transition. There are a lot of veterans that don't know what the options are. I'll be the first one to admit, when I cycled out in 1998, my transition was a one-day seminar at Camp Pendleton, and I left that 6-hour seminar going, what the hell am I going to do? I mean, I knew that I was going to go back to school, or I was going to try to attempt to go back to school, but I had a 1-year-old daughter. I was married. I was 23 years old, and I had a 1-year-old daughter, and sometimes college isn't in the books for some people because you have life. And you've got to pay the bills because now you're 23 years old, and in 23 in the Marine Corps is an old guy. I mean, let's be honest,
right?
in reality, I'm looking back at my daughter now is 23 years old, and I said, "My God, I got out of the Marine Corps when I was her age."
You're not
And
old enough to have a 23-year-old, by the way, right?
that's right. I had her when I was 11. Yeah.